Hello to anyone that's already tuning in. We're just going to give it a few minutes for our participants to get on, and then we will get started. Hello. We're just waiting for one more person. Awesome. Hello. Okay, now that we're all here, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Instagram Live, Be About Education. My name is Juliana. I am the Love is Respect Associate, and I will give everybody else a chance to introduce themselves. So if you want to go ahead and start, Mia, and then we can just jump around.
Yeah, my name is Mia. I use she, her pronouns. I have a background in sex education, but I also do sexual assault prevention here in Oregon. So.
Awesome. And Tiffy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Tiffany. I'm in the Love Youth Council, and I go by she, her.
And Katya, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Katya. I'm also on the Love is Respect Youth Council. I'm currently serving as Miss Salem, Utah, where I'm spreading awareness about emotional abuse.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being in this space with me today. And I think I forgot to mention that I also use she, her pronouns. So let's jump into our topic for today. Our first Instagram Live focused on engagement and how to get involved in your community and be an advocate for healthy relationships. And as we all know, there's so many different aspects in terms of what makes a relationship healthy or unhealthy. And a really big part of that for many people is going to be sexual intimacy and sexual boundaries. So ultimately that's what we're going to talk about today. How do you have conversations about sex, and how can you be an advocate for your own sexual boundaries? So Mia, we're going to start this off with you. What tips or suggestions would you give to a teen or young adult about having a healthy conversation about sex and intimacy with their partner?
Yeah, so first I would say that it makes a lot of sense that we struggle with this, right? We don't have representation of these conversations. You know, the media that we consume just kind of expects us to know what we're doing. So I would like to start there, that it makes a lot of sense, and those uneasy feelings about it are super valid. For tips, I would say really establishing what your boundaries are. So first kind of thinking of, what is it that I want in a relationship? What makes me feel comfortable? Starting there. So once you have your ideas of, what makes you feel safe and comfortable, approaching it to your partner. And if maybe, I think a lot of us have struggled with asking for our needs, right? Like asking, like, this is what I want, this is what I need. So if you need to approach it in the sense of, hey, what are boundaries that make you feel safe? And starting that conversation where, you can ask them, and then they're going to ask you. And then it's just kind of this overall conversation that you can have.
Yeah, definitely. I think boundaries, I agree that boundaries are kind of the biggest place to start. And a lot of people kind of might not know what their boundaries are, where you actually do have to take time to sit down and think about that. I know that I didn't know how to express my boundaries until I was much older. And even some of it came as I started doing this work as well. Katya, I want to pose this next question to you. How old were you when you felt comfortable talking about sex, and who did you have that conversation with? And was there any particular reason that you chose that person?
Yeah. So I actually had a very awesome opportunity in the home that I grew up in. My mom is a PhD psychologist, and so I grew up, using the correct autonomous sexual terms and learning about my body, and I don't even remember ever having like the talk. It just has always been something that we were able to talk about. And so honestly, like really my mom she's done a really amazing job at establishing that kind of environment. And especially as I've gotten older and my friends have started to have sex and it's just been a much bigger conversation. Anytime I have a question, I'm able to go to my mom and say, hey, what's the effects of this kind of birth control? How is this person, like, what's the emotional toll that is being taken on in this situation? And I understand that probably most people don't have that luxury. And I know there's a lot of other adults that I would not want to talk to about. And there are even some things that, I would talk to someone else about. But I think that has been super, super important and impactful in my life, is just from a very, very young age, being able to feel comfortable around the topic.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that you have that connection with your mom and that she created that space where you felt safe to be able to do that. And that's definitely, what we would hope for everybody, but unfortunately it's not always that way. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. Tiffy, I want to ask you the same question. How old were you when you felt comfortable talking about sex? And, was there a person that you felt safest to talk to, and why them?
Yeah, I feel like I started talking, or sex was like used to me when I was about like 14 or 15, like a couple years ago, in like health class at school and stuff. And for me, it was more comfortable to talk to like my friends about sex, just because we were all kind of we had like the same like questions about it, and we were all like a little confused about it, so we can like be like our for each other, and then like we didn't have to go ask questions alone, and it was just like a lot easier just to rely on them. And yeah, I feel like probably like my best that I like went to first to be like, oh, like what is this? And like ask all those like confusing questions too. So yeah.
Yes, friends are such a good source of support for stuff like that, especially because they're your peers, and sometimes it does feel more comfortable to talk to a peer than it does, with an adult, and that's completely valid and okay as well. I think for me, I also talk to my peers more than my parents, but they, also kind of opened it up as not a taboo topic where I felt like I could approach them as well. So that's amazing. And I'm glad that you both had your own pieces of support that you were able to, reach out to when that became a factor in your lives or a conversation that you were ready to have. So Mia, can you share, what are some examples, ultimately, like, we all know that unfortunately there can be some negative aspects of sex and things like pressuring and coercion. Can you share some examples of sexual and reproductive coercion and kind of explain, why that's not okay?
Yeah. So first, let's start with like what coercion is. I feel like a lot of times when I'm talking about consent and coercion, there's this like, well, what the heck is coercion? So it's essentially, it's the opposite of consent, right? It is forcing, manipulating, threatening someone into consenting, which we know consent is clear. It's, freely given, something we want to do. So that can actually look in a lot of different ways, sexual coercion. It can be something more outright, which is like that force or threat, but it can also be kind of that like nonstop asking, this like badgering until you finally like, oh, okay, fine. Or it can be gaslighting or manipulating. So that can look like maybe you say, oh, like I'm not really in the mood tonight. And they're just kind of like stomping around the house or like in a mood. And I think a lot of people don't realize that those little subtle things, like that's coercion. It's just like manipulating. It's kind of using your emotions and instead like using that to get what they want. So yeah, those are huge things. As far as reproductive coercion, that can also look a couple of ways. That could look like messing with your birth control. That could look like poking holes in condoms. Another thing that if anyone has watched I May Destroy You on HBO. Michaela Coleman did an amazing job really representing of what stealthing was. And I feel like this is something that is finally kind of coming more into conversation. And stealthing is when someone is wearing a condom and they remove the condom during the act without the other person knowing. And that is one, that's sexual assault, but that is also a huge aspect of sexual or reproductive coercion.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think one that is so new that a lot of people might not know what that is, because I've only recently heard that term myself, especially, you know, with how relevant it is right now. And, you know, ultimately, in terms of things like sexual and reproductive coercion, ultimately, like, if something feels violating to you, a lot of times there's validity in that feeling, right? If it feels like it crosses a line for you, it probably did cross a line for you. It probably means that it crossed your boundaries. And it's definitely worth exploring if you're noticing that you're having negative feelings after a situation like that. Because, you know, ultimately, you know, the hope is that it's going to be a positive experience for you. It's going to be what you want it to be, and it's going to feel good. And it's not going to feel like you got pressured into something that you weren't ready for. Because sometimes in those situations you might say yes, but it won't really feel like a yes because it wasn't really what you or that person wanted. And that can feel really violating in itself, you know, even if you did, you know, technically consent, but ultimately we know that that's not really what consent is.
Right. I think that there is, when I learned for the first time about the fawn response, so we all know about trauma responses, right? And there's the fight or flight. Even freeze has become more common, but there's the fawn response as well. And that can look like kind of, you know, going along with whatever is happening, you know, just, yeah, kind of like fawning. And that's like our reason to keep us safe, right? That's a trauma response to keep us safe. So I feel like a lot of people don't recognize coercion because, you know, that fawn response can kick in and, you know, maybe we didn't say no, but we also didn't say yes. And that's a huge thing to recognize. Not saying no doesn't mean yes.
Absolutely. That's a great point too. And definitely something I agree with. I think that, like, even in my own experiences, there were some gray areas where I was like, I don't know if I really said yes. And I think that happens for a lot of people, you know, in those interactions where they question it afterwards, or maybe it felt okay at first, but then you kind of start thinking about it and you're like, I don't know if that was okay. And I think that's all a part of kind of understanding your sexual boundaries and what feels safe and secure to you. Yeah, so Katya, in terms of, you know, talking about sex, do you feel like you or your friends, you know, hesitate? I know that you shared that your mom is a big factor in somebody that you feel comfortable with, but in general, do you feel like you kind of hesitate to talk to older adults about sex?
Absolutely. I have noticed that, especially with the older generations, there's this very, very traditional view on what is and is not appropriate when it comes to sexual relationships. And that looks like things like, you know, other sexuality, premarital sex, or anything kind of that could fall into that that's seemed as not okay to some of these older generations. And so it can be really, really scary to go to these people about it and be like, hey, I'm having this problem. I had this experience. And I feel like instead of addressing the actual experience, like I've heard older adults say, well, you shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. And it's like, that's not what I want to talk about. And so, and that's one thing I've actually really appreciated about the younger generations that we've created is we're kind of able to look at the situation for what it is and address the topic at hand, and then maybe address some of the other things later at another time. But first and foremost, making sure that you're comfortable, that you're okay, that you have your questions answered, that you are in a position to where you feel safe and you can trust the person that you're talking to. Because just going towards the traditional punishment kind of thing, that's not really going to help us and make us feel comfortable. And, you know, the older people say like, oh yeah, you can come to us when you need help. And then that's not always actually true. because they don't want to help us. They just want to prove themselves right, I guess. And so I have many, many friends who, they came to me about something and they were like, I am terrified about what's happening in my body right now, but I can't talk to my parents about it. Like, I can't trust them with this information. And then they're stuck and they're scared. And it's really, really sad, because if they just took a minute to listen, everything would be a lot better and we'd all be a little more safe.
Absolutely. I think, ultimately youth have the most relevant perspective in terms of what they need and feels comfortable in these conversations. So it's definitely important for adults to be listening when youth are talking about it, when teenagers are talking about it. And I definitely think that, it is about, the biggest aspect is how it feels to you, that safety aspect. And it's always going to come back to that. And so, Tiffany, I want to ask you the same question. Do you feel like you hesitate? I know that you said that you tend to lean towards your friends more. Do you feel that you hesitate to talk to older adults about sex? And if so, why?
Yes, I do. And I agree with Katya about how, the older generation just has a different viewpoint on, how sex should be talked about. And so, sex was not talked about as much in my house. So talking to, an adult, I feel a lot of judgment. And that's why going to friends and having this youth council is really helpful, because it gives me the opportunity to talk to other people that are closer to my age and have the same experiences. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I definitely think nobody wants to feel judged when they're being vulnerable, and opening up about something, especially something that can be as personal as sex. I think it's definitely best to approach it from that non-judgmental aspect. And, ultimately, you don't want to create a situation where somebody's going to feel ashamed because they came to talk to you about something that was already hard for them to talk about in the first place. So those are some really amazing points. We've got, a couple more minutes left. So Mia, I just want to just kind of circle back to you and see, is there anything else that you feel like, within this topic that is just really important to mention?
Yeah, I would say, again, recognizing we weren't given this representation. I don't know about you, Juliana, but the sex education that I was given growing up was really bad or just non-existent. So, it makes sense that we now kind of have all these questions. So validating that. Wow, I have so many thoughts. I think that really what it comes down to is recognizing that of any relationship that you should be in or should want to be in is one that you feel safe and happy and comfortable. So you should be able to have these conversations. These are things that you should be able to talk about in a happy, healthy, safe relationship.
Absolutely. And I just want to sum it all up by reminding everyone that consent is key. It has to be present and ongoing in every situation. And in my opinion, it is one of the most essential aspects to having healthy sexual relationships, right? Making sure that both, and that is the comfort aspect, right? Making sure both people consent and they're both in a space that they feel comfortable in. And ultimately that's going to make, those conversations easier. And it's also ultimately going to flourish your sexual relationships in a different way because you feel safe. I really want to thank all of y'all for being in this space with me today. This has been such an amazing conversation. And I know that this is such an important topic, and I wish that we would have had conversations like this when I was younger too. Because I think that for me, in terms of what you mentioned about sex education, we heard about things like protection, but it wasn't always talked about emotional safety, right? How do you keep yourself safe emotionally with sex? And I think that's what we're really talking about today, is those conversations and that emotional aspect. So this was amazing again. I want to remind everyone that this is the second of 3 Instagram lives. So we will have a third one on February 28th. And that one's going to be about empowerment. And that will be, you'll get to see some more youth council members, and our Love is Respect director will be facilitating that one. And ultimately, if anybody has questions about sex or relationships, healthy sexual boundaries. Love is Respect is here 24/7 for those aged 13 to 26. You can contact us by our chat information is on loveisrespect.org. You can also find information to call us there, or you can text Love Is to 22522. But yeah, thank you all again, and I hope everyone has an amazing rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.